Welcome to another edition of Tuesday Horror Tales. I am your host, Dutta. Tonight, I will share with you all a story entitled A Shade Too Soon by Jug Suraiya. After dinner, we talked about ghosts. We were sitting in what had once been the library in the big rambling house, sitting in that quietly smoking circle, surrounded by the heavy bookcases of law, literature, and obscure Victorian memories, which in turn were enclosed beyond the walls by the midnight jumble of North Calcutta. We felt secluded and yet protected, like children wrapped in blankets and flanked by adults on cold and specially dark nights. There had been a marriage in the big house, in some complicated offshoot of the family tree, and Freddie had invited a few of us from the college, chiefly for the dinner, which had indeed been fantastic. The flurry of more important guests long over, we sat and talked and smoked in the library. Freddie, immaculate even now in his silk kurta and intricately pleated dhoti, presided over the conversation. We, others in mundane shirts and trousers, were a little awed of him on that evening of flowing chadars, sprinkled rosewater, and elegant ritual. We almost stopped calling him Freddie. Relaxing now after the strain of the evening, he still had a quick edge which gleamed. His minute attention to details of hospitality, he was pampering us with an almost narcissistic delight in his own subtle grace and charm. In his dark hands he held one of the roses which the guests had been given. As he talked, he twirled the silver-papered stem, traced the warm red contour of a petal with a fingertip, or dipped his head to the fleeting fragrance. He could easily have been sitting for one of those massive portraits which line the high walls. There was almost overpowering sense of dynasty in those halls. Suddenly, someone asked as though on a cue whispered off stage, "How old is this house, Freddie?" He smiled and the flower in his hand stilled. "Pretty old. My grandfather, that one there, he built it about 100 years ago." He swiveled in his chair, his outstretched arms with a flower at the end of it, arranging compass. All around this was open land and jungle. Timeless night fraught with menacing greenness stole in. Had tigers walking between tapestries of lianas, a growing distance from the dusty pane, while heavy-lidded men drank tea from blue French china, and the voices of women lilted from the inner rooms. Someone laughed a mere fraction of an octave too high. "This place must be haunted." "Not," said Freddie, and his voice was a shade gleeful. "This particular room." We edged our chairs closer together ostensibly to hear better the round of stories everyone knew was coming. Deep, as usual, was the first to speak. He told us about an experience, allegedly terrifying, he'd once had while on a shoot in Bihar. It was a long anecdote, lugubrious in its repetition of details which seemed to get nowhere. It contained the standard quota of haunted dark bungalows, one in particular, local people who warned the shikaris not to stay there, no less than 3, and the inevitable eerie noises during the nocturnal hours, exact number fortunately unspecified. At the end of the whole thing, I doubted whether Deep had been on a shoot to Bihar or anywhere else, let alone seen or heard of any of the ghosts he spoke of in this entirely long-drawn tale. Freddie sat patiently through all this, even managing to look politely interested most of the time, like a star musician in an orchestra who knows that it is his night and is waiting for the prelude to be done with so that he can launch into his solo. And he was in no hurry to start. The conversational circle finally came to a halt in front of him, and we all looked at him expectantly, somehow confident that he wouldn't let us down. But he just sat there, quietly smiling and playing with the flower until finally someone had to prompt him. How about you, Freddie? Aren't you going to tell us one of your stories? He looked down at his dark hands where the red flower bloomed, and his voice was as smoothly modest as a rose petal. Well, I don't know. These murky elemental goings-on all of you have been describing have no affinity for me. Perhaps it's just that I'm not psychic or something. He let the anticlimax sink in, and then, almost casually, my father, though, you met him this evening, did have a rather odd experience in this house years ago before I was born. Freddie's father, of course, we recalled this kindly-looking, quiet-spoken man we had met. His every casual word or gesture was avidly re-examined, loaded in retrospect with a powerful significance. Freddie's father. We should have known. What actually happened? Blurted Deep, and we sat back in our chairs and waited for Freddie, grown suddenly serious, to tell his story. My family, as you know, has been living here for 4 generations. It's a joint family, always has been, and the house has always been full of people, various aunts, uncles and cousins, their visitors, children, servants, a busy, brightly lit place, except during the war years, 39 to 45, and once again somewhat later. I think it was sometime in 1942 that the Japanese dropped a few bombs on Khidarpur. Comparatively little damage was done, but there was panic in the city. The Burma campaign was going badly for the Allies, and the people in Calcutta half expected the armies of the rising sun to come marching in any day. The bombing was the cinder in the haystack. The trains were packed with people leaving for the safer hinterland. Property prices crashed, and they say Panwalas became real estate tycoons overnight. Well, my family didn't sell out, but it was decided by my grandfather that everyone should move to the country house about 50 miles further west. The old man felt, quite rightly, that no one was going to blitz rural areas, so everyone was sent off, no arguments either. The old man, as you can see, was a bit of an autocrat. Shortly after the evacuation, my father decided that he had to come to town for a few days for some business. Though he's told me the story twice or thrice, he's never told me exactly what business. I don't think there was any. He has been embarrassed at having to leave Calcutta, and this was his way of reassuring himself and at the same time showing that the city was not anywhere near as unsafe as people, or rather some people, made it out to be. There was quite a ruckus, I believe, but my father had his way and came back to town. You should hear his description of the city in those days. Blackouts, of course, and the big house all deserted and shut up, American and British soldiers all over the place, getting into fights, lording it around, the spooky wail of sirens echoing in the night streets. The way my father tells it, he seems to have enjoyed every minute of it. He could have stayed with friends, but probably felt guilty about putting up with those who had remained behind, not deserted, as he put it. Anyway, one of the main ideas of coming back was to stay in his own house. One or two of the trusted servants had volunteered to stay behind to look after the place, and they were very happy, though a little worried, to see my father. They opened up his room for him, brought him some hurriedly prepared dinner, and then he sent them off to their quarters. Incidentally, my father's room is the one behind that door there. We turned to look at the door set in the wall at the farther end of the long room. Well, he soon settled down for that night. The room was a bit musty, having been shut up all those days, and though he had opened the windows, there was hardly any breeze, and the atmosphere was very close. He couldn't sleep, so he decided to read a little. But he had brought only a newspaper with him for the journey, and had already finished reading it. There were no books in his room, and his place was locked up. Anyway, the reading light would have necessitated shutting the papered panes, so he sat by the darkened window to get what little fresh air there was. The street below was deserted. It was then that he heard the sounds of someone running, gasping for breath, in the corridor just outside. At first he thought it was one of the servants, but no one came to the door. Just the quick light steps and the snatching gasps, neither nearing nor seeming to retreat. The strangeness of it did not strike him even then. He was in his own room, in the house where he had lived all his life. He pulled the door open and stepped out into the unlighted corridor and turned on the light switch just beside the door. She was standing there in the corridor, a girl of about 17 or 18, like a trapped animal twisting around to look at unseen pursuers. Even in the moment of shock, he realized she was very beautiful. He was a young man then, of course. Then someone from the street shouted, "Light!" and the girl, ignoring my father, ran past him into his room. My father hesitated briefly, but there were no further sounds from the corridor, and he switched off the light and turned back to the room. She was standing there, staring at the door, but even in the pale moon glow, he could make out she had not noticed him. In her hysteria of terror, he did not exist for her, and suddenly, as though by contagion, he felt the fear flowing like a cold blue current through his body, and the room was full of the smell of roses. Freddie paused and bent his head to the flower in his hand, and I felt the hair on my forearms begin to rise. The only sound in that room was the breathing of the girl, harsher and sharper as the panic within her contracted and squeezed. She was crouched forward, every sense, every quivering nerve transfixed by a wordless menace that pressed in closer. Then my father shouted. He says now that if he hadn't done that, he would have lost his mind. Literally, the smell of terror and roses. He doesn't remember the exact words, but it was probably something like, "Who are you?" And as though in response, the sleeping sirens of the city sprang into screaming life. It was an air raid alarm. The sudden tug of noise jerked his head towards the window, and when he looked around again, she was gone. Within a second, with no sound, and the smell of flowers had gone too. He stood there in that empty room while the sirens wailed and fell and rose again. He says now that even if a bomber had scored a direct hit on the house, he doubts if he could have registered the situation. Fortunately, no bombs fell in Calcutta that night. Hardly any ever did, you know. And the sirens lulled and then sang out again in the all clear. Finally, my father managed to grope his way to bed and sprawled across it, past questioning, past fear, in a state of numb exhaustion. But as I said, he was a young man and a very strong-minded one. And by morning, he was normal, as he was going to be for a fairly long time to come. He didn't tell the servants anything except that he was going back earlier than expected. He stayed 2 or 3 days more with a friend and then returned to the country house. He didn't tell anyone of what had happened or what he experienced, even when it was time to return to the city and to his room. He says he slept with the lights on for the first few nights, then it was all right. The inexplicable episode, for all its horror, might even have been forgotten, put down as a bad dream, induced by post-travel tension. But then, in 1946, the Hindu-Muslim riots broke out, and once again the family was shipped off to the country. And that's when it happened. People had become beasts in those terrible days. You have heard about the murders, the atrocities. This area was a sort of no man's land, bloodily contested by armed groups of both communities. Everyone lived at a taut pitch of suspicion. Every individual was either an ally or a mortal enemy. No one knows how or why the girl was in this area. She must have got separated from her family in the chaos of the streets. A mob, a Hindu one incidentally, not that it matters, spotted her and chased her. She ran into this house. Perhaps the gate was open, or perhaps the old Darwan opened them. They followed her through the empty rooms and corridors, and then finally found her in the room that was my father's. They must have seen by now that she wasn't Muslim. She was not dressed like one, and she had vermilion in the parting of her hair and wore a mala of lilies and roses. She must have been married a very short time. But they raped her, and then they killed her. And when the others came later, they said the room had smelt of flowers, especially roses. Freddie paused and turned the flower very slowly, almost languidly between his fingers. In a voice drained of all tonal color, he said finally, "Not much of a ghost story, I'm afraid. Most of those have their punchlines in their pasts. This one had it in the future." The silence was a hush. Then Deep, the irredeemable, came in. "But I don't understand it." Freddie replied softly, "Understand? I don't think it's something which one could understand. Call it a particularly vivid premonition or a psychic chain reaction set off by my father's overstrained nerves, and which had a tragic coincidence later. People talk of fields of psychic emanation. Why must these work unilaterally from the past forward? Why not the other way around as well? All I know is my father hasn't used the room since. It was very late and we were all tired. The evening had come to its conclusion. With a rattle of chairs, We got up to leave, and I casually picked up the cloth-bound book lying on the table. The faded title on the spine said, "An Anthology of the Supernatural and Strange." I wanted to borrow the book, but Freddie smiled apologetically and said he had borrowed it himself and promised to return it the following day. I smiled in return, but before putting the book down, opened a random page. The dried petals had been pressed between the pages as they scattered across the table. Rose petals, and they left behind a faint but unmistakable fragrance of roses. Dear folks, roses are red, violets are blue. Not all ghost stories are always untrue. Folks, take care and stay safe. I'm your host, Prajna, signing off for tonight. See you again next week.